I've been reading a ton, searching for some of these intriguing, less known characters or stories in the Bible. And I had this list going of possibilities. Oh, I still do. And as I dug deeper into each of them individually, I realized that there were three that I was looking at that were all tied together. And I didn't even realize it until I started really doing the deep dive. And so that intrigued me enough that the next 3 weeks, we're going to focus on three that kind of have a pattern, a flow that go one to the other to the other. Okay. So the first one today is going to be Jeroboam. And then the next one, because of what we will learn today, leads to a story about an unnamed prophet. And that leads to the story of a third king named, or a king named Josiah. Okay, so that's the pattern we're going to take the next 3 weeks. So does anybody know anything right off the top of your head about Jeroboam? Who he was in the Bible? This is so good because I know who he was, but I didn't know all the details that I get to share today. So let me set the scene as we bring in this character, Jeroboam. A very prominent character, by the way. So King Solomon is on the throne of Israel. And even though he started out, as we know, wise, he sought wisdom, God gave him wisdom, and he was godly, he ended his reign with a very hardened heart toward God and God's ways. Okay, so God was not happy with Solomon, who had, by the way, taken like 700 wives, 300 concubines, which is, many of them were from foreign lands, which is why Solomon got led astray to all the idolatry and the false worshiping of gods because of all these women, right? So here they are back in idolatry once again, and he was heavily oppressing the Israelites, taxing them in order to fund his lavish lifestyle with all these wives and concubines, okay? So, the nutshell, Solomon. There are two men of importance at this point in Solomon's life. His son, Rehoboam, who is the only named son of Solomon recorded in the Bible, which is interesting to me because if he had 700 wives, he had a lot more sons, right? So the only one that was named is Rehoboam. And let's just say the apple doesn't fall far because Rehoboam's corrupted heart exceeded that of his dad's, okay? So as Solomon dug deeper into his destructive and heavy-handed leadership, God decides to make a change with the other man of significance in Solomon's life, who was Jeroboam. That's who we're going to talk about today. Jeroboam was not a relative. He was simply a trusted employee of Solomon. He had proven himself to be trustworthy, so he was given leadership amongst the reign of Solomon. Okay, so before Solomon dies, God sends a prophet. He has a name and a space, but I can't remember it and I didn't write it down. Anyway, he sends a prophet to Jeroboam, the employee, not the son. And this prophet at this point is wearing this big fancy new cloak that he had designed and had created for this particular encounter with Jeroboam. So he gets Jeroboam alone to talk with him. And in front of Jeroboam, the prophet takes off this new cloak and he starts tearing it. And he tears it into 12 pieces. Okay, so according to 1 Kings 11:31, the prophet said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." So that's why there were 12 pieces. 10 of them were given to Jeroboam to represent the 10 tribes that God was going to give into his hands. Okay. The prophet explains that he's doing this because Solomon stopped doing what is right in the eyes of God and has not kept God's laws and is worshiping false gods again. Okay, so side note, why 10 tribes and not all 12? As one scholar put it, and I'll just read what he said, God would still keep one tribe under the house of David in faithfulness to his promise to David. So the promise that the Messiah would come from the lineage of David meant that he would offer one tribe to remain with the tribe of David. Okay. So, nutshell version, that's why Jeroboam gets 10, and we'll see that Rehoboam is left with just 2. Okay. So the promise to David from God that Christ will come, this is a messianic prophecy that the Messiah will come from this lineage. This promise to David from God is unconditional. Okay, so he told David, this is what I'm going to do. It doesn't depend on your obedience, doesn't depend on anything except for my plan and my promise. So even though Rehoboam the son is more evil than Solomon, as we will soon see, God kept him in his place, but significantly reduced his reign. Okay, so Jeroboam is now being told that he's going to be made king of a majority of Israel. However, unlike the covenant with David, there is a condition. And this was the most important thing that Jeroboam needed to hear. So 1 Kings 11, 37 through 39, this is the condition that the prophet spoke about what God was saying. He says, however, as for you, Jeroboam, I will take you and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If, focus that word, if you do whatever I command you and walk in obedience to me and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David, my servant, did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. So if you listen to me, if you obey my commandments, then I will significantly bless you as much as I did David. That's a huge promise. That's a huge outpouring of God's favor. All he had to do was submit to the ways of God now. And even though God wouldn't deny David and his descendants because of his promise, he would be sure to humble them before Jeroboam as the new king. Okay. So Jeroboam, a man that never expected to be a king, is given an opportunity by God personally to make some changes in the lives of the Israelites. So news travels fast. Solomon hears about this encounter with the prophet and Jeroboam and this promise from God. And Solomon tries to interfere with God's will and tries to have Jeroboam killed. So Jeroboam fled to Egypt until Solomon dies. I'm giving nutshell versions. We don't know how long this lasted between this threat to his life and when Solomon dies. But we know one thing is for sure. Solomon hated Jeroboam so much, and that insecurity that this new calling on Jeroboam had risen up in Solomon was now passed on to his son, Rehoboam, who, when Solomon dies, would be named king of Israel. Okay? So there's a rivalry already going about this plan that God had set in motion. Okay, so Solomon dies. Rehoboam is made the king of Israel, the whole of Israel. Okay, but not for long, because Jeroboam realizes Solomon's dead and he comes out of hiding. And along with some of the elders, they go to Rehoboam and they confront him. Follow me so far? Anybody lost? Okay. So Jeroboam and these elders go to confront Rehoboam. And in a nutshell, they basically tell Rehoboam not to make the same mistakes Solomon made, that his father made, by heavily taxing the people and the citizens to maintain your luxurious lifestyle. Do something different than your dad did. Okay. But you need to understand that this was a bargaining of sorts. This wasn't a plea for a desperate plea on their behalf. This was them basically saying, we don't have respect for you as Solomon's son. We will offer our allegiance to you only if you agree to our demands. So imagine how a new named king who's already greedy, who's already insecure about Jeroboam, has these Jeroboam and these people saying, we're not gonna bow to you if you don't meet our demands, right? Well, more nutshell, Rehoboam refuses, and he pridefully answers by saying this: you think my father was bad? You have no idea what I am capable of. In no uncertain terms, he basically said, my father beat you. I'm going to torture you into submission. Okay, so this is the heart of Rehoboam. This led to the uprising of the people against Rehoboam. So what's interesting is God didn't just say, you people go with Jeroboam and you people go with Rehoboam. God allowed the evil and the sin of Rehoboam to make it a natural process. Does that make sense? So the uprising happens, and just as prophesied over Jeroboam, the people of 10 tribes decide to create their own kingdom, and they make Jeroboam their new king. The only 2 tribes remaining in the kingdom for Rehoboam were the tribes of Benjamin and Judah. And so begins the official division of the 12 tribes of Israel into 2 kingdoms. Anybody ever heard that before? All ordained and orchestrated by God, which means God can keep his promises and punish at the same time, which is exactly what he did. He kept the promise through the prophet to Jeroboam, but he also punished Solomon's kingdom, so to speak, under now Rehoboam. So we now have the southern kingdom of Israel, which is led by King Rehoboam, and the northern king led by Jeroboam. So we have a new opportunity. Jeroboam has the world at his fingertips. He has like a white, clean slate. So what struck me is what happens when we follow Jeroboam into this divine calling of being a king. What is he going to do as he enters into leading a kingdom back into worshiping the one true God? How do you think he handles this new beginning? Does he cling to God's promise? Well, that's where we're going to pick up the story, and that's what we're going to focus on today, okay? 1 Kings 12:25 picks up the story at this point, and it says, then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Peniel. Okay, so seems like just logistics, whatever, but there's importance to this. Jeroboam needed a capital city because Jerusalem was in the territory now of Southern Kingdom, right? Of Judah and Benjamin. So he had to choose the city of Shechem. He chose the city of Shechem. Now, one may assume that this is a wise choice because Shechem was called a place of commitment. It was in this particular location of Shechem that Abram and even his grandson Jacob had built altars to God. So there's some spiritual history here. It represented the faith of their ancestors and that long-running relationship with God. And once the capital in Shechem was established, Jeroboam built Peniel. And again, possibly a wise choice because of that location, as he knows it. He chose it because that's where Jacob wrestled with an angel, a story that we've often probably been told. Again, our ancestors have religious equity in these spaces, okay? Godly things have happened in these spaces. So it looks like with energy and devotion, he seems to be on track, right? Building a nation on the foundation of his faithful ancestors. Foundation is the key, right? To any endeavor, much less spiritual endeavor. However, let's label this as mistake number 1. He built the foundation on man, not on God. See, the right thing would have been to establish a new kingdom where God led him to establish it, not based on the history of their people who have often been led back into idolatry in those very spaces, right? So it appears his heart had, in fact, been so tainted from the influence of working for Solomon that the idea of building a foundation on God never entered his mind, even after being given the promise. Now, remember, in the promise that we read from the prophet, that God told him he would be ruler of all that his heart desires. It's if and only if you let me lead you, if you let me listen to me, if you know my commandments and obey them. It's as if God is testing Jeroboam as to what was in his heart. Because how often do you hear God say, I'm going to give you all that your heart desires, without wanting to reveal what's in the heart, right? So anyway, it is as if God is testing Jeroboam as to what is in his heart. And sadly, the remaining scriptures reveal his heart's desires were not compelled or persuaded by this calling or promise from God. I wish I had better news, but right out of the chute, Jeroboam is not living up to the conditions that God put on it. Okay, verse 26. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. Okay, what he's saying there is, wait, we've built this, but now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If these people that I have now with me, if they go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they will kill me and return Rehoboam and be under his reign. So they will return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So let's label this mistake number 2. He began with an inward conversation with just himself. Notice it says, he said in his heart. He says to himself, self, let me play this out for you. He says, self, Jerusalem is still the spiritual center of gravity for the Jewish people. They will still be required, based on their covenant obligations under the law of Moses, to travel to Jerusalem. And as he's talking to himself, the thoughts begin to snowball. The temple is there. They have to go make sacrifices there. What will happen when they return home to Jerusalem? And as a conversation with ourselves often does, this gets out of hand. Wait a minute, when they go back, they're going to see friends they're going to miss. They will be impressionable while worshiping in the temple with all the nostalgia of what once was, and maybe start longing for what once was. I mean, after all, isn't that the pattern of the Israelites? They long to go back to slavery, right? They may think that they made a bad choice and turn again to Rehoboam. And he keeps going down the rabbit hole, and then they're going to kill me. Do you see what's happening here? He starts with, this could happen. And now it's suddenly, and they're going to kill me. Not they might kill me. He has played this whole scenario out in his head. They're going to kill me and go back to him. They will return to Judah. I will have no one left. Nobody likes me. Everybody hates me. I think I'll go eat worms. I mean, it was basically just what happened in his heart. His conversation with himself, okay? Insight number 1, a conversation between me and myself that remains only in my head and heart will take on a life of its own. And this is exactly what happened with Jeroboam. This kind of conversation is where a feeling snowballs from a tiny thought to a larger worry, to an even bigger fear, to lies disguised as reality, to details that feel real but are non-existent in the real world. And all of that steers us into making decisions to deal with this fabricated dilemma, which, as Jeroboam will prove, are usually the wrong decisions. So question, he's human, we're human. Have we learned to steer?
I found this on the web.
No, I don't need you, Siri. Thank you.
Check it out.
Sorry. We're human, they're human. He's human, we're human. Have we learned to steer our inward conversations, the thoughts in our head and heart? Or do they tend to take on a life of their own? I mean, does anything good come from an isolated inward conversation when there's no accountability to truth? A place where the heart, which is deceitful above all else, is driving the conversation. That is what happens here with Jeroboam, because he said in his heart. Okay, so desires and fears took over Jeroboam's being because, as it says, he said in his heart, convinced now that this is reality. Look at the beginning of verse 28. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. Mistake number 3, he took counsel from man. Now, processing and taking counsel with another person isn't bad. However, what Jeroboam did was present a false reality to the others he was seeking counsel from, who were determined also not to live under the reign of Rehoboam. So together, in fear, instead of losing this new kingdom and returning to a tyrant, they created 2 calves of gold, which we all know represents what? Idolatry. So he processed inwardly, he processed outwardly, but what made these conversations so fatal to their future was mistake number 4, he never processed or had an upward conversation with God. Right out of the gate, Jeroboam seems to forget or completely ignores the promise God made to him through the prophet. The best way for him to secure the throne was through obedience to the commands of God. Instead, because he left God out of the conversation, because he followed his fearful and wicked heart, he sets himself and a nation up for failure. Insight number 2. If God isn't a part of the discussion, the dialogue will always be led by our own heart's desire. And isn't our heart and mind where it all goes wrong? Or can go wrong? Where good intentions become victim to our human frailty and limited understanding or insecurities? Question: how long into a self-reflecting process do you go before including God in what is being processed? Are we aware? How long do you sit with fear or worry or stress or circumstances or perceived issues before asking God to be a part of that talk, before he asks him to be a part of that conversation that goes on in here? Whether it's chit chat or deep discussions, it's important to put God before the heart, even before the counsel of other people. If he had processed upwardly, he would have acknowledged that God chose Jerusalem as a place for the people to worship. He didn't need to be intimidated by God's commands to make sacrifices on that particular altar at that particular temple. But because his heart, mind, I know I'm beating a dead horse, but it's so important because this is where we all go wrong, right? His heart and mind created a false scenario that God never intended. And in return, he created a false scenario that was never needed. He didn't know how it was all going to work, so he made sure to take it upon himself. He made sure he had a plan. And so he took a whole ton of people down with him, because look at the rest of verse 28, after constructing 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Then this thing that he just did became sin. Became a sin for the people, because those people went as far as Dan to be before one. before one of the calves. Okay, for the sake of ease, let's combine two similar mistakes in one. Okay, mistake 5, he replaced God with idols, and he reduced genuine worship to a matter of convenience. Okay, so first of all, he stands before the tribes with this golden calves on display and says, behold your gods, little g here. This is the God right here that took you out of Egypt, right? These are the same words that Aaron spoke 500 years before this, when he created a golden calf for the Israelites to worship while Moses was on the mountain. Now, let me talk a minute about why our image is wrong. Why is the golden calf wrong? Other than it violates the second commandment, let's put a little bit more definition behind it. As one scholar put it, and here's a quote, there is no image or artist that can create, mold, or shape anything that could adequately represent God. An image limits the attributes of God. Or as Jeannie put it from Aladdin, it confines phenomenal cosmic powers into a tiny living space. Okay? You can't comprehend it, right? An image of a bull or calf was actually chosen, most likely because of their Egyptian influence. And the image represented strength. And although God is strength, it doesn't say anything about his love. In fact, most of the pagan gods that you hear of in the Bible, or Greek mythology gods, they were all associated with only one main characteristics, right? There was a goddess of fertility, a god of the sea, a god of wisdom. The one true God will not be limited in this way, and any image you concoct cannot incorporate everything of who God is. So nonetheless, with a chance to start over, return to worshiping the only one infinite God of the universe, Jeroboam, as his first real act for the people, replaced the one true God. And he represents to this God the image of strength alone. God's like, I am so much more than that. But he also reduced authentic worship to a matter of convenience. Something more practical. Okay, so Dave's going to bring up a map because I really want you to see this. What you need to understand is that this time, God's presence resided in the temple in Jerusalem. Remember? That's why the temple was built, for God's presence to reside in. That is why the temple was built. That's why God commanded sacrifices to be made there in his presence. But Jeroboam says, oh, that's so much work. He says, you've traveled so far for too long, right? He's saying that's so much work. You don't need to do that anymore. So look at what he does. So he takes the two idols. Here's Jerusalem. There's one way up here in Dan. There's one right here in Bethel. So all you people up at Dan, you don't have to go anywhere. We're going to make it so easy for you. And all you people right here so close to Jericho, or so close to the border, look, we made Bethel, we made the Cav, we made a place of worship closer than you could go to Jerusalem. Strategic. A man-made plan to keep his constituents from going to the one true God. Do you see the importance of that visual? So, for all of you up in Dan, you can leave it up for a second, honey. For all of you up in Dan, don't stress and spend time or resources to travel all the way to Southern Kingdom. It'll be hot. You won't want to make that travels. I put up a statue right here for you, so close to Jerusalem, you don't even have to cross the border. You can take it down. Insight 3. He led the people to believe that convenience supersedes obedience. However, convenience often negates true and complete obedience. Isn't that what Western Christianity has become? A matter of convenience. Practical is better than purposeful. Here's some examples. Let's just expedite the act of worship and make shorter services. After all, our attenders want to beat the Sunday lunch crowds, right? They want to get to their favorite restaurant. They want to get on with their day, especially if the weather's nice here in the Northwest. By the way, I didn't understand the idea of church being seasonal until I came to the Northwest. Because growing up in Texas, there's never a bad weather day that says, oh, we have 3 months, we're going to make the most of this. So it's cultural in some respects too. Let's accommodate them even more with a fast forward feature as they watch online. No need to shower, get dressed, fight parking. No effort or sacrifice needed. Now, those things are not bad, and they have served their purpose. But at what point does convenience supersede complete obedience? Because the convenience of what Jeroboam set up for them superseded the command that God said, you need to go to Jerusalem to make the sacrifices and to worship me. Insight 4. Understand that authentic worship should require a sacrifice before God. Even though they could still sacrifice lambs at the place of their idols, it wasn't before God where God was reigning at that point in time at the temple in Jerusalem. And they no longer had to sacrifice money or time or energy to make those sacrifices or that worship in Israel. God was not in those places that Jeroboam made available as a pseudo temple. Now, yes, let's fast forward a minute. Jesus is our ultimate sacrifice as believers today, right? But he didn't do it so faith would be convenient for us. He made the ultimate sacrifice as a perfect man without sin because we could never do that on our own. Worshiping the one true God should still come with a sacrifice on our behalf. Sacrifice of time, energy, money. I could go on and on and on, but it shouldn't be about the most convenient time to pray or the convenient time to read his word, convenient time to go to church. It becomes a sacrifice of our desires, our ways, our rhythms to yield to the commands and fully follow what Jesus is asking us to do. Question, as a follower of Jesus in this time and culture, what does sacrifice look like? Jesus said, if you want to follow me, then take up your cross. That means we all have sacrifices to make, other than not choosing sin. And it will be unique to each of us according to what our heart tends to hold on to as to what we need to call into a place of sacrifice for Jesus. Another question, how has convenience reduced our authentic worship of God as he calls us to obey his commands? These are questions I want you to just chew on for the week because they're personal questions. We are all inundated by different things and different aspects in our workday or the people around us or our family. Those are questions I would encourage us all to, like I said, chew on. Neil A. Maxwell was a scholar and religious leader, and he said this, on the straight and narrow path, there are simply no corners to be cut. You cannot cut corners to being a true follower of Jesus. Oh, but Mr. Jerry the King doesn't stop there. As if all of this wasn't bad enough, let's look at the remaining 3 verses, 31 through 33. He also made temples on high places and appointed priests from all the people who were not of the Levites. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made. And he placed in Bethel the priest of the high places that he had made. This is I will clean this up for you, I promise. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart. Get that? And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel and went up to the altar to make offerings. Mistake number 6, there's no other way to put it. He took on the role of God, period. First of all, he made temples on high places. It wasn't just Dan and Bethel anymore. He started putting them all over to make it more and more convenient as he got more and more control and reign. When he saw people were listening, he's like, oh, I'll make it even more convenient. But God had set the boundary that only a Levite could be priest. Do you see what he did? Jeroboam says, we're going to be all inclusive. We'll accept anybody who wants to give it a go. Anybody can be a priest now. Don't worry about the lifelong training or being called or ordained or the accountability that comes with being a priest. That's no longer important. So he superseded God's command by himself ordaining priests. Even the legitimate priests that were living in the northern kingdom at this time did not like this. They left and they returned to the southern kingdom because they knew that the repercussions of Jeroboam making this decision especially had crossed a line. And they wanted their hearts to seek God. They had been tricked enough to believe that, okay, God can be in the calf, whatever. But now, no, you're telling us that these other tribes can be priests? That's not what God told us, okay? This exodus for these priests, these Levites that were living in his kingdom, as we will learn next week, is not going to be very helpful for Jeroboam because he's basically left with nobody who has a heart seeking after God in his kingdom. So let's bring it to our culture. There's a lot of examples I could use, but let me just use one example. Anyone right here, right now, can go online and be ordained, licensed, and give permission to perform a wedding ceremony. Anybody can do that now. Why is that a problem? Because a minister or a judge who has been given permission and license to marry a couple performs a wedding knowing that they are legal representation, but not only legal representation, they're representing this union as a blessing from God when they stand up and say, do you? Right? There's a representation from God in this. That comes with great responsibility and accountability. When we as ministers are standing up before a couple, we are to answer to God that we believe that couple should be unified for life, that they are equally yoked, that they have the tools that they need to have that lasting union before God. It's not just about giving them permission to say I do and signing a certificate. All of that is stripped away by enabling anyone to stand in front of any couple and say, this is okay with God. Because not everyone has a heart that seeks after God, that has the ability to speak on God's behalf. And that's what Jeroboam was giving to anybody who wanted to be a priest. That was a deconstruction of faith as God designed it, which we all see many times in our culture now. I could do a whole message on that. But Insight 5, everyone cannot be all things. Quite frankly, because God did not design it that way. God designed us to be uniquely gifted individuals. There's an order to this design where we talk about the puzzles that fit together because we're not all doing the same thing. When we deconstruct this order, that's when chaos ensues. Romans 12, 6 through 8 says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Not all of us are called to lead. Not all of us are called to teach. Not all of us are called toward mercy. Lord knows I am more judgmental than I am merciful. But we all have that gift that God has given us. And Jeroboam took a gift that was given to the Levites as a tribe and said, anybody can do what you do. And it didn't get done well. Let's just put it that way. So based on a lot of what we've talked about so far in Jeroboam leading these people astray, here's a question. Are you postured, as we've talked about, are you postured before God in a way that you recognize when a pastor, a teacher, myself, or even a fellow believer is minimizing the word or commands of God? Especially as we get into the end times, we better know what we need to know so that we are not led astray by the one that will deceive and try to lead us astray. So finally, the last part of the scripture reveals Jeroboam taking on the role of God by creating a feast. But if you notice the date that he mentioned and you understand the date of the actual feast, that he was not trying to replace the feast in Jerusalem. Oddly enough, it was to compete with the official feast in Jerusalem because the feast that he scheduled is actually 1 month later. Why? Because at this point, he had become so confident in his own program that my way is the best way, the right way, and people are following it, and now I'm secure in what I have been doing, so I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm going to go even further away and stand on my own as a God. And of course, like it says, it was all devised from his own heart. Once again, his heart led the way. He's a true example of those who create their own religion according to their own taste, their own desires, their own needs. And do you know that he's the only king in the Bible? Of all the kings that we know, I mean, I more than all of our hands combined, we can name kings that were evil that led the Israelites into idolatry, right? We all know enough of those stories. But you know, he's the only one that is given the title of the one who made Israel sin in Scripture. That's how far his heart led others astray. And next week, we will piggyback on this as to what happened in his kingdom as a result of the Levites leaving and them being left open before the enemy. So, Western Christianity, I mean, we have to, what does that mean for us today? In my opinion, a lot of Western Christianity has become a pick and choose as long as I go along, according to how I feel, what feels right, what fits into my schedule, all of that. And I think we're all given a new beginning every day. Jeroboam was given an opportunity to create something new, well, to return to, but create a new experience with the one true God that they had fallen so far away from. But just like Jeroboam, this is a huge one because this was the initial beginning of the split for the tribes, right? Big piece of history. But once again, let's bring it back down to the small. Let's make it practical. Jeroboam was given this awesome opportunity, but it was conditional on if you obey, if you do these things. We're going to get to where Jesus correlates that for us now. But here's a challenge. We're given a new opportunity every single day. It says every morning we have new mercies to start fresh. Yesterday doesn't matter. What matters is what are you going to do now? What are you going to do what are you going to do even though this last moment you lost your crap? You have a new moment to walk into, to change that, to start afresh. to make a change, to make an impact, to make influence in the lives of others. And I believe that even in this small group, we can be instigators in helping bring revival to a very complacent nation. It just has to start with us in our own heart. Question: how is God calling you to a deeper commitment and obedience to his command? Another one I want you to sit with this week. Who around you needs to be a witness of this newfound devotion or a deeper devotion or a deeper commitment to God? Because people are always watching. We may not transform a nation overnight, but we can transform and help be a part of God transforming people around us every day. And if we're not leading people to Jesus in a deeper faith, are we leading them away? Jeroboam purposely, intentionally, out of insecurity, led the people down a path of idolatry. But my thought was, in our absence of saying anything, are we letting people be led astray? And I ask this question because Jesus himself extended what was told to Jeroboam. In Matthew, Jesus says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Is that not a command that Jesus has given us himself? How often do we really act upon that command? Because Jesus says, if you want to be my disciples, you must take up your cross and follow me. How do we have to die to ourselves so that we are actually making disciples outside of ourselves? It's not just us becoming disciples. How do we make disciples of those that God has placed in our lives and around us? Because if we're making it just about us, isn't it just about our comfort zone? Maybe this is the area that we pray for as a church, that we get out of our comfort zone and go, what does God want to do in this neighborhood, in this area of the city, in Spokane, that can start by building a foundation of prayer and obedience to God's word here and now.